Thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening to me kibitz with our speaker tonight. Thanks for joining us. Another one of our Safer at Home series talks. So before we get started tonight, I want to remind you that all our talks are brought to you by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings, and 8 Cousins has copies of all of our books. So they're in addition to this one, they've got all the books that are on this series. If you got a question, remember to use the chat feature, and if you can, make sure that you mute yourself. If you've gleaned by now, our speaker tonight, Daniel Immerwahr, is a professor at Northeastern University in Evanston, Illinois, but he's coming to us from Chicago. Yes, as we like to say at the University of Illinois, if you can't get into Illinois, you go to Northwestern. But I'm just snarky like that. So he's a professor of global history, and he's written a book about a look at the American use of empire. Is that a fair thing to say? So we welcome our guest tonight, Daniel Immerwahr.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Mark. Thank you so much for inviting me to this. I'm going to attempt an act of technical proficiency and share my screen. Let's see how that goes, and then we can proceed from there. Okay, I think we're in. So what I want to talk to you today is about is a book that I've written that tries to look at U.S. history from a different angle. And to get us into that, I want to start with one of the most familiar episodes of U.S. history and kind of use that as a starting. I think if you were to ask people in the United States what events in U.S. history that they could put a date to, that like not only do they know what year it happened, but they know what day on what year it happened, I don't think you'd find a lot of answers. I think there's basically 3. I think that one is July 4th, 1776, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. People know what date that happened. Another more tragic one is September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda's attacks on New York and Washington. And I think the other one you'd get would be December 7th, 1941, the date which will live in infamy, when Japan attacks a naval base at Pearl Harbor, the base is Pearl Harbor in the territory of Hawaii. This event is a huge part of the kind of national mythology. It's how the United States tells its story to itself. And the event has 2 features that are kind of interesting together. One is that this is the thing that draws the United States into the war, into World War II. And the other thing that we say about it is, well, you know, I won't say it myself, I'll just give you Richard Nixon's version of it. Pearl Harbor is interesting because it's the only piece of American territory that directly suffered from enemy attack during World War II. That's Nixon's way of saying that, and that's a kind of thing we often say. It turns out that second thing is wildly incorrect, like deeply, amazingly incorrect. And it's kind of interesting that Nixon got that wrong because he served in the Pacific during the war. So just a refresher for those of us who aren't up on our World War II history, this is what happens that day. This is the attacks of that day. Here's a map of the Pacific. So the Japanese do attack Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. That really happens, and it does a great military damage to the United States. But that's not the only place that they attack. Within a matter of hours, on the same day, Japan attacks Wake Island. What is Wake Island? Wake Island is is part of the United States, in it's annexed to the United States, but it's uninhabited, meaning there's no indigenous inhabitants of it. Although it's uninhabited, there are about 3,000 people on it, a number of civilians and military personnel who are building airfields and such. Okay, so that's perhaps a minor footnote, except Japan does not stop there. It also attacks the US territory of Guam, which is inhabited and does have an indigenous population, and it attacks the largest colony that the United States had ever held, the Philippines. And on a spree, Japan also attacks the British territories of Hong Kong and Malaya and the independent kingdom of Thailand. This all happens on a single day. I mean, the matter of a day is a little confusing because those of you who are sort of geographically astute will notice that these attacks take place on either side of the international date line. So what date it is when it happens depends on where it is, but they all happen within hours from a kind of sunrise to sunset day. I want to draw your attention to the Philippines particularly, not just because it's a large place, but it's also because the military damage in the Philippines, according to the U.S. Army's official history, is as bad as the military damage to the U.S. Armed Forces in Hawaii. So in the Philippines, the Japanese take out the bulk of the sort of largest collection of U.S. warplanes that are outside of the continental United States, and do enormous damage to the possibility that the United States will be able to defend itself in Asia. There's another reason I want to draw your attention to the Philippines too, which is that the attack in Hawaii, the Pearl Harbor attack, is just that. It's an attack. The Japanese attack, they do enormous damage, and that's the end of it. The attack on the Philippines is a little different. The Japanese attack, they do enormous damage, and then they attack again, and they continue attacking. And in fact, they invade and occupy the Philippines, such that the largest U.S. territory is, for the bulk of the war, Japanese held. And immediately after this happens, right, the day after, there's a question, which is how to describe what happened. And those of you who've lived through and remember September 11th will probably remember a similar kind of nomenclatural confusion. What do we call this event that happened? We asked ourselves on September 12th. It took a while for people to agree on just the date as the name of what happened. And partly it was confusing because the attack had happened in multiple places, and it wasn't clear what the most important was. And it took a while for all of that to shake out. A similar thing went on with the event that we know as Pearl Harbor. That way of describing it, Pearl Harbor, no one used that in the hours and the days after the attack. It took a little bit of time for that to solidify. And so you can see newspapers that say things like, the Japanese attack Guam and Hawaii, the Japanese attack Hawaii and the Philippines. It wasn't clear how to locate the attack. It wasn't clear how to tell the story. Eleanor Roosevelt gave a speech the evening before FDR gave his date which will live in infamy speech. And she said, this is an attack on our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines. Those were the two targets that she felt were the most important, and indeed they were the most militarily important targets. The draft of the date which will live in infamy speech also did that. It also nominated those two places, Hawaii and the Philippines, as really the places that the people should pay attention to. FDR took a look at that draft. It wasn't prepared by him. It was prepared by his trusted Undersecretary of State, Sumner Welles, and rejected it and replaced it with his own draft, which he then kind of altered, in a series of edits. Here's a great thing about being a historian. Sometimes you just have the document you want. And we've got FDR's draft number 1 of his speech, including his penciling emendations as he sort of goes through the day and decides what to put in and take out. So this is it. I'll read it, and I know it's probably small on your screen. The first line reads, the original draft reads, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in world history. And then FDR scratches that out and changes it to a date which will live in infamy, which is a very good edit. And you can see he makes a lot of edits. And one of the edits that he makes is to this issue that I've been flagging, the question of how do you describe what happened. The original version, which we can sort of make out under FDR's scribblings, is Japanese air squadrons commence bombing in Hawaii and the Philippines. So he's doing the same thing as Eleanor Roosevelt had done. He's nominating these two places, except, and this is about the 7th line down if you want to try to squint, except that FDR scratched out references to Hawaii and the Philippines. And in successive drafts in his speech, he made it all about Hawaii. The speech is really focused on Hawaii. Now, if you know the speech really well, there's a kind of less appreciated back section to it where he lists all the other targets, but he lists them in a scrambled order so that British targets and US targets are all in there, and the sovereignty of none of them is clarified, and they're all mixed up. The focus of this speech is on Hawaii. That raises a question. Why? Why did FDR want this speech to be about Hawaii, despite the fact that Japan attacked other places as well? Well, I'm not a mind reader, and we don't know exactly what was going on in his head, but I am a historian, and I can give you a pretty good guess. We have opinion polls from right before the attack that we know as Pearl Harbor, and where people in FDR's audience are asked, um, would you support U.S. military defense of, and then various places are listed. And by and large, when the far western territories of the United States, Guam and the Philippines, are part of the question, people in the United States say, no, I would not support a US military defense of those places. So there's very little public support for the idea that the United States should defend these places. Um, Even when it came to Hawaii, the support could be a little wobbly. Um, in 1940, Fortune magazine did a similar kind of survey, and it asked readers which countries the United States should protect if it came to war. And 55% said that the United States should defend Hawaii. And asked yes, no. Should it defend Hawaii? Yes, no. 55% said yes. Officials in the territory of Hawaii hit the roof when they saw this survey. And they did for two reasons. I bet you can guess one of them. The most, I think, obvious one is 55%. That's a really low number. 55% of people in the United States think Hawaii is worth defending. Think about how that feels to hear that if you live in the territory of Hawaii. The other thing that they were very angry about, and I know this because they wrote angry letters to Fortune magazine expressing their ire, had to do with the way the question was worded. Which countries should the United States defend? Which countries? What do you mean, which countries? They asked Fortune magazine. Hawaii is not a country. It's a territory. It's part of the United States. It's an integral part of the United States. To ask the question like that, to ask which countries, is to set us in Hawaii up for that horrible answer. Hawaii is not a country. It's part of the United States. I think FDR had that question about Hawaii in mind because he made so Hawaii had a significantly larger white population than the Philippines or Guam did. And I think that made it more amenable to people, in FDR's audience wanting to defend it. But nevertheless, there were question marks about Hawaii. And I think FDR was aware of these because he made one final edit to his speech. This is between the last draft that we have and the actual version that he gave. And I don't know exactly when he made this, but I imagine him sort of on his way to the podium, like Columbo, just being like, one last thing, one more thing. And so the edit he made was also to that line that I've drawn your attention to, where FDR describes the location of the attack. And he changes it from, as the final draft had it, Japanese air squadrons commenced bombing on the island of Oahu, to the new version he changed it to the American island of Oahu. The American island, because FDR was aware that his audience wasn't entirely sure in their heart of hearts if Hawaii counted as part of America. And if they didn't get that, then the whole speech doesn't work, because the point of this speech is to say the Empire of Japan attacked the United States of America. And if you don't recognize Hawaii as part of America, then the whole thing falls apart. So FDR added that word just to kind of firm up his case, rounding Hawaii up in the eyes of possibly dubious audience to America, and just not even trying with the Philippines. This is a huge speech, and it was recognized as such at the time, but nevertheless, it wasn't an entirely effective speech. It was effective in drawing the country into war, but on this other matter, the kind of making sure that people understood that Hawaii was really part of the United States, that was a harder sell. One thing that FDR did is he asked, in subsequent speeches, he asked people in his radio audience to buy maps and atlases so that he could, as he described the unfolding war, they could follow along in their maps and atlases. And it was a kind of bonanza for atlas publishers, because they were selling them left and right. One of the companies that sold them was based in Chicago, where I'm beaming to you from, was Rand McNally. And so it had all these like special wartime atlases, which are kind of repurposed versions of its normal fare. But nevertheless, it sold them. And I found this incredible account, or I thought it was a lovely account, of a classroom of 7th grade girls in Kalamazoo, Michigan, who are doing what the president had asked, and they have their Rand McNally wartime atlas, And one of the girls turns to a seemingly uninteresting back page of the atlas. It's an index. It's just a list of the foreign places, cities, and other places that are going to appear, and what pages they're on. And what the girl noticed is that in this list of foreign places, she could find Hawaii, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico, which prompted some questions, which prompted questions that I presume this is what happened. She asked the teacher, and the teacher turned to the class. But anyway, the effect of this was the entire classroom of girls sent a series of letters to the Rand McNally Publishing Corporation asking them what gives. In what meaningful sense are these places foreign to the United States? I thought Hawaii was part of the United States. I thought, in fact, that's why the war was happening. What do you mean by listing them as foreign to the United States? They sent these letters to Rand McNally, and Rand McNally wrote back. So this is the sound of Rand McNally explaining to a classroom full of seventh grade girls in Kalamazoo, Michigan, why places like Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Hawaii should be listed as foreign. Although Hawaii belongs to the United States, says Rand McNally, it is not an integral part of this country. It is foreign to our continental shores and therefore cannot logically be shown in the United States proper index. I will be honest, I don't totally know what that means. And I'm fairly certain that the girls didn't either, because they forwarded the entire correspondence to the Secretary of the Interior asking for adjudication. And in doing so, they supplied a cover note saying, "We believe this statement," i.e. Rand McNally's statement, "is not true. It is an alibi instead of an explanation." The Department of the Interior wrote back to the girls. That's how I know about all this, because all this is in the Department of Interior's records. It wrote back to the girls, and it clarified, yeah, of course, they're totally right. Hawaii is part of the United States. So is the Philippines. So is Puerto Rico. Of course, they're part of the United States. They've been annexed to the United States. They've been part of the United States for decades. Nevertheless, that question, is Hawaii part of the United States? What about the Philippines? That question is one that I think haunts US history. And the reason it does is that if you ask most people in the United States to imagine what the country looks like, to map the country in their minds, the mental map that I think most people will return is this. The political scientist Benedict Anderson called it the logo map, meaning that if the United States had a logo, this might be it. And, he's not entirely wrong about that. But here's the thing, that map that we're all so familiar with, that's not an accurate map. And okay, we probably can say, okay, yes, Alaska and Hawaii belong on that map. So that's one way in which it's not accurate. But actually, it's a profoundly bad map. One reason it's really bad is that if this is your kind of static view of the country, as any US historian will tell you, that the country hasn't always looked like that. It started out significantly smaller, and it was only through a series of wars and purchases and dispossessions of indigenous people that the United States finally filled out that familiar profile. And the last bit was the Gadsden Purchase, ratified in 1854, that kind of gave you that shape that we all know so well. So that's one reason. But the other reason is that after the United States acquired that shape, it didn't hold it for very long. In fact, there are only 3 years of US history where those are the borders of the United States. There's 3 years where that's an accurate map of the country. And the reason is that right after the ratification of the Gadsden Purchase, right after those became the borders of the United States, it started expanding more, and it started expanding overseas. First, it did this through a series of uninhabited islands that contained nitrate-rich guano, and that was very useful as a fertilizer at the time. And the United States claimed in the Pacific and the Caribbean nearly 100 of them over the course of the 19th century. It started in 1857. Then, soon after that, 1867, it acquired the territory of Alaska, which is actually quite large. And then at the end of the 19th century, the United States entered a war that Spain was already fighting with Spain's colonial subjects. There was sort of an empire-wide rebellion. It entered the war, and as a part of, as sort of, it ended the war by claiming 3 of Spain's colonies, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and then in a kind of fit of imperial enthusiasm, also annexing the non-Spanish lands of Hawaii and American Samoa, and then occupying Cuba. So it's a kind of imperial shopping spree that the United States goes on around 1898. And that, totally alters the map of the United States. It totally altered it, but it altered it in a way that I think a lot of people don't recognize. You know, I grew up in Pennsylvania. I was educated in New York. At no point in my high school or college education did anyone show me a map of the United States that had Puerto Rico on it, or Guam, or any of these places. And I realized that actually maps are like that are really hard to come by. And I decided that I wanted to make my own map of it, which I'll show you in a second. And because I just had a really hard time finding the country mapped accurately. One way it's mapped inaccurately is that we rarely see places like Guam and Puerto Rico on maps of the United States and American Samoa. The other way in which it's often mapped inaccurately, you probably know this, is that you'll see Alaska on a map because now it's after it became a state, but it's like shrunken down in some little inset in the Pacific, and shown way smaller than it actually is. This, by the way, is a map of the United States done by an Alaskan. I love this map. So what does it show you? It shows you the thing that you usually see on maps of the United States. It shows you Alaska, what Alaskans call the lower 48, and Hawaii, but it shows you them, from an Alaskan's perspective of what's important, where all the loving cartographic detail has been lavished on Alaska, and the lower 48 just looks like Gumby, some deformed green little blob. So I wanted to see the United States with all the parts shown in an equal area projection, everything shown to scale. And so I made that map. I made that map for myself. Here's the United States on the eve of Pearl Harbor. This is what it looks like. Now, there's a caveat that I have to give, which is that I've shown all of the inhabited parts of the United States to scale, but the uninhabited islands, many of them the so-called guano islands, I've put clusters of those in the lower right and left. I've made those a little bigger so you could see them. Otherwise, they would just be too small to see. But all of the inhabited parts are shown to scale. And when you look at a map like this, you realize some things. I mean, Alaska's enormous. It would kind of stretch from coast to coast over the contiguous United States. The Philippines is quite large as well. But you also, I think the most important thing you see is that the place that I had grown up calling the United States, that logo map, is just not the whole of the country. It's a big part of the country. It's an important part of the country. It's a populous part of the country, but it's not the whole of the country. And in fact, it's a little unclear what to call it. I didn't grow up with a name for it because I just called that the United States, and I didn't think too hard about the other places. People living in the overseas territories often call that contiguous blob the mainland. I think that's a pretty good term for it. That's the mainland. It's part of the United States, but it's not the whole of the United States. Look, my point isn't just acreage. I also want to draw your attention to the populations. This, again, from the eve of Pearl Harbor, in the overseas territories of the United States. If you look, I won't talk you through all these numbers, but what you see quickly is that a lot of people live in the Philippines, but Puerto Rico, Alaska, and Hawaii are also non-small. And if you add up the entire population in the inhabited overseas territories in 1940, you were talking about nearly 19 million people. Another way to say that is that if you live in the United States in 1940, meaning the whole thing, not just the mainlands, there is a 1 in 8 chance that you live in an overseas territory, i.e. there's a 1 in 8 chance that you are colonized. Another way to say that is that if you live in the United States in 1940, meaning the whole thing, not just the mainland, you are more likely to be colonized than you are to be Black, or that you are to be an immigrant. That's how many people, colonized people, there are living in the United States. And that's kind of the bid for this book I've written, How to Hide an Empire, History of the Greater United States. What I tried to do was to go back and to learn and then to write U.S. history, not as the history of the logo map of the mainland, but as the history of all of the land over which the United States government has claimed jurisdiction. And the argument is that it comes out differently, that U.S. history comes out differently when you see it like that. The title of the book is called How to Hide an Empire. It's just kind of a playful title. And the reason I gave it that title is I think that one thing that's really interestingly distinctive about the United States is the degree to which the parts beyond the mainland of the country have been hidden, have been obscured from view. And one way to appreciate the distinctiveness of that is to compare it to the British Empire. The British had a world-spanning empire in the 19th and early 20th century, but they were not confused about that fact. Here's just a kind of ordinary quotidian way in which that was expressed. It's a Canadian postage stamp with a map of the world and all the British parts painted red. This is a familiar image to people who lived in Britain at the time of the heyday of its empire. Partly it was a familiar image because there was a holiday in Britain called Empire Day that was started out unofficially, but then became official in 1916, where school children would be, shown this map and, made to examine all the parts of the world that are British, and they would dress up in national costume from, Burma and, the Ivory Coast and the Gold Coast, excuse me, and all these British colonies. So, that's a way of kind of announcing and proudly announcing empire. Interestingly enough, the United States had a similar holiday, a patriotic holiday. It started in the schools and became official in exactly the same year, 1916. But its patriotic holiday was Flag Day. And it was explicitly about celebrating the unity of the nation. It said nothing about the sort of United States as an empire. And the thing that school children were made to venerate on Flag Day was the flag, which had one star for every state, but no representation at all for the territories. That's what I mean when I say that the United States has just kind of hidden its empire from itself. But I think that hiding has mattered a lot. I want to tell you one example, one kind of way in which US history got different for me once I started looking at it, as the whole thing, not just the mainland, that emphasized the importance of that hiding. So it's from the time I'd already started talking about World War II. In the lead up to World War II, the United States was, could see the possibility that Japan would expand in the Pacific, and in doing so attack its overseas territories. And what did the United States do in preparation? Not a lot. It was very hesitant to build up colonial defenses in places like the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii. And in fact, the most consequential thing that the United States did in the sort of looming shadow of a potential Japanese attack was to set the Philippines on a pathway to independence. This happened for economic reasons, but also with the sense that if the Philippines could be made independent quickly enough, then if Japan attacked the Philippines, that would no longer be Washington's problem, that the Philippines would just have to defend itself. And this was something that US officials expressed very clearly to Filipinos. I'll give you some flavor of what that happened. So the way it worked is that the United States put the Philippines on a countdown to independence starting in 1934, and the independence ultimately would be scheduled for quite a while, for 1946. And when this happened, the Philippines got a new government, a new kind of government, the Commonwealth government, a sort of transitional government, and elected a president, this guy named Manuel Quezon, who was going to be the president of the new government. He gets elected, and to be inaugurated as the governor of the Philippines, or the president of the Philippines, excuse me, he asks for a 21-gun salute in the honor of this great occasion. And FDR gets the message that this is what Quezon wants, and refuses, and kind of counteroffers a 19-gun salute, pointing out that you may be the president of the Philippines, but Philippines is still under US control. You are not the head of state. I, not you, am the head of state. Quezon is sort of humiliated by this, and alternatively threatens war, and then threatens to boycott his own inauguration, and then just sort of backs down and agrees to the 19 guns. Nevertheless, too few guns would be a sort of theme in the coming years of Philippine history. And it would be because, just as everyone predicted, Japan attacked the Philippines when it sort of started moving in the Pacific. And as it did, Japanese forces quickly defeated the US armed forces built up there and started moving up and down the archipelago, at which point Quezon demanded immediate help from the United States, from his government. Send battleships. We are getting invaded right now as we speak. And as he asked for that help, he sort of butted up against a really hard fact about US military policy, which that the United States had committed itself to a Germany first policy. The idea is that the war would be fought in two theaters on two fronts, and that the United States would have to prioritize those, and it would prioritize fighting Germany in Europe over fighting Japan in Asia and the Pacific. and the Japanese confrontation would be sort of kept on the back burner, and Japan would, take a few victories while the United States was mainly dealing with Europe. And then once Europe was in hand, the United States would return. Look, war is hard choices. I don't even know that this was the wrong choice, but it was a choice that had costs. It had costs if you, for example, were an Asian colony that was getting invaded. And it wasn't a secret choice either. Quezon could hear FDR, because FDR would go on the radio and talk about the need to defend England. And imagine that from a Philippine perspective, hearing the talk about the need to defend England at a time when the Philippines is actively getting invaded. Quezon gave this sort of soliloquy that we have recorded by 2 U.S. military officers that I want to share with you. It's strong language, but it's strongly felt. "I cannot stand this constant reference," he said, "to England, to Europe. I'm here and my people are here under the heels of a conqueror. How typically American to writhe in anguish at the fate of a distant cousin while a daughter is being raped in the back room." That uncomfortable end phrase, ending on the back room. The back room is not the worst metaphor that I've heard to describe the place of the colonies in the political fabric of the United States. Unable to get reinforcements, Quezon then demanded independence. He said, okay, if you can at least give the Philippines immediate independence, then as a head of state, I can negotiate with Japan. We can have a peace. Maybe Japanese troops can go through the Philippines, but they won't have to fight for it inch by inch. And this also went up the chain of command to FDR, who refused. No, the Philippines cannot negotiate with Japan, he insisted. The US flag is here, and the US flag, FDR said, will be defended to the death, which is stirring rhetoric. It's stirring rhetoric, but it's also has a sort of ominous tone to it, especially given the Germany first strategy. And how ominous that was came through very clearly in a conversation that the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, had with Winston Churchill about the Europe first strategy. Churchill asked Stimson, basically, we, the British, we're thrilled with this Europe first strategy, wouldn't have it any other way, but just want to make sure that you understand the consequences of it, meaning that, you will take losses in Asia and in US parts of Asia, and we just want to make sure you're okay with that. And to which Stimson replied, "There are times when men have to die." Which is true. I mean, that is how war goes. But this is basically an apportioning of where they're going to die. So as everyone predicts, Japan takes over the Philippines, and by all accounts, it's a brutal occupation, as Japan is hardly trying to prepare to fight a larger war against the United States. It sees the attack coming, and it's just trying to shunt the entire Philippine economy into the Japanese war machine. Filipinos resist. The Japanese repress that resistance brutally. There are beheadings in the street. I mean, it is a very hard time in Southeast Asia, kind of all over. Eventually, the United States does return. It returns under General Douglas MacArthur in MacArthur's words, to liberate the Philippines. But of course, at the end of this, the Philippines isn't going to be independent. It will just be a U.S. colony first. So it's in some ways to reconquer the Philippines. The fighting is going to take place up and down the archipelago, and it does. But it concentrates on Manila, which, because of just the Japanese sort of economic strangulation of the Philippines, and so many people are just literally starving in the countryside. Manila has inflated to the point where it has 1 million people in it, which point it is now the 6th largest city in the United States, if you still count it as part of the United States. And that's where a lot of the fighting is going to, not all, but a lot of the fighting is going to take place. The United States starts its assaults on Manila by bombing it, Japanese targets in Manila. And there's a kind of queasy logic to this, which I think is really well expressed by this pamphlet I found in the archives in Manila. This is something that US bombers, they dropped paper as well as bombs, and this is one of the pamphlets they dropped. It was a warning. Filipinos, American planes are bombing and strafing this area. Remember, we don't want to hurt you, but bombs cannot tell friend from foe. And then it lists all these military targets that Filipinos should stay away from, including roads. I think this pamphlet gets both parts right. We don't want to hurt you. That part is absolutely right. The U.S. Armed Forces have no interest in hurting Filipinos, who, after all, are U.S. nationals. But the other part is also right. Bombs can't tell friend from foe. Things get a little messy, and they get bloody when you just start bombing a large city. After the bombing, the United States prepares to take Manila on the ground, and at first it has a kind of artisanal strategy. So U.S. sort of units will enter buildings where the Japanese are lodged and go into those buildings and get in firefights and stairwells and such, and try to retake the buildings that way. But that's a militarily expensive strategy, and after a very short amount of time, it becomes clear to commanding officers that if the United States persists in doing that, it's going to take some losses in its uniformed servicemen. So with that logic in mind, the lead unit that is taking Manila switches, the 37th Infantry Division switches to a new tactic. And the new tactic is, okay, don't bother targeting individual Japanese enemy. Any building where the Japanese might be located, just shell that building to the ground. And the logic here is expressed by the commanding officer of the 37th Infantry Division, General Robert Beitler. And he says it like this: to me, the loss of a single American life to save a building was unthinkable. And, you say it like that, I totally agree. Lives versus architecture, I would also choose lives. But there's something that's not being said here. There's something that's kind of being elided with a sort of sleight of hand, which is this phrase, American life. When he says American life, he doesn't mean the life of a U.S. national. That would include Filipinos. He means lives of mainlanders. And when he's thinking about these buildings, he knows that these buildings aren't empty. The buildings are occupied. That's the whole point of taking them down. The U.S. Army suspects that they're occupied by some Japanese soldiers or Marines, but they might not be. They might be occupied by Filipinos. In fact, a lot of them quite clearly are. And even if they aren't, the buildings next to them might be. So the costs of this, just take down any potentially dangerous building strategy is the cost of what you might imagine. If you level a city, you will harm a lot of people in it, as not intentionally, but as collateral damage. And I just want you to keep that in mind as I show you some images that I collected from the archives in Manila. They're not grisly, you won't see any bodies, but you'll just get a sense of the scope of the destruction. As within a month, the 6th largest city in the United States is brought to the ground. The month-long liberation of Manila, that strategy that Beitler had, that it worked. It worked in the sense that mainland lives were protected. In a month of very bloody fighting, only 1,000 members of the U.S. Armed Forces, about as far as we can tell, died in this fighting. So I mean, that's a lot, but it's given the violence of it, it's not as many as some might have feared. But the costs of it were paid elsewhere, and the costs of it were particularly paid by Filipinos. And we think that month of bloody fighting, 100,000 Filipinos died. Some of them died by being killed by Japanese, but also a lot of them died by being in or near those buildings, as those buildings were just shelled. And that's a pretty good proxy for World War II in the Philippines. Overall, the war killed, and this is especially killed in the later months of the war when the United States and Japan are fighting over the colony. Overall, the war killed, by the Philippine government's count, 1.1 million Filipinos. And if we add in other deaths, so Japanese deaths, of which there are a lot, and mainland deaths, of which there are not very many, U.S. mainland deaths, we're talking about 1.6 million people dead on all sides. 1.6 million, that's the bloodiest thing that has ever happened on U.S. soil. That's 2 civil wars. And yet, when I was taught U.S. history, this wasn't even mentioned. It wasn't in any of my textbooks. And the reason, I suspect, is that when we think about U.S. history, we think of the United States just as that logo map, and we don't really appreciate these places as part of the United States. Once you do, U.S. history comes out a little differently. The last thing I just want to share with you is, well, this is one of the images that I think haunts me the most of that I've seen from the Battle of Manila. It's, again, you don't see a corpse, but just something about the look in her eyes and the look in his eyes as this GI carries this woman to safety is, for me, hard to forget. I won't dwell on this image because it's a sort of unpleasant one. There were a lot of scenes like that in the immediate aftermath as U.S. Soldiers kind of went to just clean up the enormous destruction. And I read a lot of memoirs, including memoirs written by survivors, Filipino survivors, who talked about what that was like. And I want to just share with you one interaction that is described in one of these memoirs. It's from a guy who was a kid at the time. His name was just Oscar Valladolid, who he encountered a GI who was, kind of going in and doling out cigarettes and chocolate, as cold comfort for what had just happened to the city. And he gives some chocolate to young Oscar. And Oscar says, "Thank you." And the GI kind of like startles and asks, "Huh? How'd you learn American? How'd you learn to speak American?" And Oscar is like, "Okay. Well, when you colonized us, you brought over a number of mainland school teachers, and that was enough to start English as the language of instruction in Philippine schools. And so the result is that me and frankly all the children around me who went to these public schools, we learned English. That was the language of the schools. So that's why I can speak English." And the GI is sort of even more confused and looks back at Oscar and says, "We colonized you?" And in his memoir, Oscar just is like, "I can't believe it. How does this guy not know that? How does this guy not know that?" And you think about it, it's kind of incredible. It's not like he got plopped down in the Philippines. He crossed the Pacific. This is clearly an important place for him. He might die there. He's seen people die there. I mean, this is not a place he's going to quickly forget. And yet it's a place he profoundly misunderstands because, he's given a map, he's given a gun, he's told whom to shoot, but he still thinks he's invading a foreign country. He doesn't get that Oscar is just like him, a US national. And that confusion, I think, is rife and has really warped US history and our own sense of what the history of this country is, because too often it's been a history as seen from the perspective of the confused GI. We colonized you. And so what my goal was to write a book that retold US history, but told it from Oscar's perspective. Yes, the Philippines is part of the United States. To see US history not as the history of the mainland or of the logo map, but as the full thing, what some people call the greater United States. Okay, I've droned on. I really thank you for your patience and attention, but I'm happy to talk a little bit if we want to.
Thank you, Dr. Immerwahr. That was awesome. And I was just about to say that for people that haven't read your book, you write about American history, but from the perspective of the colonized, not the colonizers. And I think that's a is that a fair thing, a fair summation?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I tried to sort of move the camera angle in all kinds of places, and but I really tried to make sure that you could see the map of the United States as people like Oscar Valladolid saw it, and B, that you could also that there would be voices of colonized people in there, and that you would hear their voices, not just kind of see things as they might have seen them. So yeah, that was a really important perspective to restore, although it's not the only one.
One of the things I learned from your book, and you did it, you talked tonight about the World War II perspective, but you did go back into the 1898, in the beginnings here, and you certainly have. Is it fair to say you don't have a lot of fondness for Theodore Roosevelt? Is it?
Yeah. I mean, I end up. Well, no. Look, here's the really important thing to say about Theodore Roosevelt. I think if your understanding of the United States is just like the states and the people who Roosevelt felt were his constituency, then he looks like a really interesting sort of progressive figure. I mean, he was sort of, trust buster, et cetera. But the man was explicitly genocidal. I mean, this really needs to be said. So, I mean, both in his understanding of the proper relationship between the United States and native polities within North America, the Indian Wars. He was a wild enthusiast for the notion that the white race should violently displace other peoples and fill the waste space. So I mean, it's, you hear him talking about frontier wars and Indian wars with a kind of bloodlust, and he went out to the West hoping to take part, and he felt disappointed that there were no Indians for him to fight. And the other part of it is that he was president during an incredibly brutal war in the Philippines, a war of pacification after the United States acquired the Philippines in 1898, and was completely comfortable and protective of the military's massacres and torture. So it's really hard to come out of this kind of a history from this kind of perspective with the same sort of affection for Theodore Roosevelt that people like Elizabeth Warren have voiced. And also, I make fun of him a little bit in the book. I will admit that I do that. So he's very mockable as well.
I did not know this, and I learned it through your book. For those that don't know, I think we've all heard the poem by Rudyard Kipling, "Pick Up the White Man's Burden."
Yes.
You give the full title, "Pick Up the White Man's Burden." That it's the U.S. in the U.S. and the Philippines. What is it?
I think the full title is "White Man's Burden: An Address to the United States." So it is not, as I had always assumed, Rudyard Kipling just like waxing lyrical about the British Empire. It is Rudyard Kipling giving advice to the United States, and particularly to his friend Theodore Roosevelt, who gets an advance copy of the poem about what to do with the Philippines. And by just this wild historical coincidence, it is published on the day that the US-Philippine War breaks out. So the United States had annexed the Philippines, but at that point was fighting Spain for the privilege of colonizing the Philippines, wasn't fighting Filipinos. February 4th, 1899 is the day that both the poem gets published and the United States just starts fighting the Filipino armies, the nationalist armies, against Filipino independence.
As you showed the stamp from Canada, Empire Day, juxtapose it with Flag Day. The U.S. clearly wants to be an empire led by Theodore Roosevelt and people like that. We want to have colonies. Heck, Belgium's got colonies. We want to sit at the big kids table. We can't just, and yet we're not seemingly proud of it. Is there something more laudable about England beating their chest and saying, look what we got? Or is it the juxtapose the two approaches. The U.S. is subtle and the British is overt.
So I mean, one thing to say is that there is a brief moment when right around 1898 when major leaders like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson are explicit about empire. They use the C word, colonies, and they're proud of it. So there is like a brief moment when that kind of British performativity about empire is in view, and often it's inherited from the British, right? They're like, okay, now we are also a mature, powerful country like Britain, and that because we have colonies, and we're not shy about it. But yeah, that's right. The United States sort of snaps to the grid, and it goes back to this story that it tells about itself, which is that it's a republic, not an empire, and it's different from other places. And that's a really interesting question you ask, is like, would it be better if the United States were just upfront and kind of celebratory about its empire rather than, in denial about its empire? I don't know. I mean, both of them have, choose your poison, I suppose. I mean, there's something a little gross, to my view, about the British celebration of dominance of non-white peoples and extra-European spaces. I mean, I don't find that very laudable, but at least it's frank. And I think a lot of the damage that has been done within the US empire to the US colonies has often been damage that has been either amplified or even caused by blindness and neglect, rather than just kind of a forthright, like, okay, this is what's happening. We have these rights, you have those rights. And so, I don't know. I had this argument recently with a fellow scholar who studies Puerto Rico and who is herself Puerto Rican, because Trump was sort of saying the quiet part out loud and talking about Puerto Rico in really sort of scornful but very loud ways. And I thought, oh, this is not good. And she said, actually, it's helpful. it's helpful just to hear it said out loud, because then we can really start talking about it. And so she was like really feeling like the Trump presidency was a boon, because it was a moment when the silence could finally be broken.
Got some questions here. How does the land mass and population of the United States colonies compare with other colonial powers, contemporary and through history?
Yeah, that's really important, and that might have something to do with the kind of self-obscurity of the United States as empire. So, so the United States has, by the early mid 20th century, the fifth largest colonial empire, and for a brief moment after World War II, it has the fourth largest. So it never has the largest colonial empire. I'm measuring by population. And it's always had its size of its empire is always dwarfed by the British Empire until the very late 20th century. But it's important to keep the magnitude in perspective. In the British Empire, at the height of its kind of empire, there's about a 10-to-1 ratio of colonized to colonizers, and for the U.S., it's closer to a 10-to-1 ratio the other way, of people who live in the U.S. mainland versus people who live in the overseas territories. So, although the overseas territories are large, and like millions of people live in them, they never have the kind of demographic weight that the colonized population does within the British Empire.
Before I forget to, for those living in Falmouth, you probably know this, but you mentioned about the guano colonies as uninhabited. A part of Falmouth, now known as Penzance Point, was actually used as a guano factory back at the turn of the century. So we had our own little guano colony there. Question: what's your thought about statehood for Puerto Rico and the handling of existing territories?
Yeah, I have a really clear answer for you, which is that I don't have an answer. And the reason is that, look, I mean, okay, we have to ask who should answer this question. Who should decide what the status for Puerto Rico should be? So there are roughly three options: independence, which is very unpopular on the island; statehood, which seems to have a bare majority of support, although kind of, that's arguable; and some version of continued Commonwealth status, which is what Puerto Rico has right now. We've never had a time when there was a binding vote in Puerto Rico about what Puerto Rico's destiny should be, and we're far overdue for that. So Puerto Ricans should decide. That's my view, and U.S. Congress should follow whatever Puerto Ricans decide to do. And I think there's just been, up until the entire history of the U.S. relationship with Puerto Rico has been a history of mainlanders like me deciding policy for people in Puerto Rico. So on that basis, I think that's got to stop. So I don't have a take on it other than a procedural one. If that's where Puerto Ricans are going, if that's where they want to go, then the U.S. Congress should affirm that, and Puerto Rico should be welcomed as a state. And if Puerto Rico wants something else, then that should happen as well. Interestingly, in the mainland, the politics about statehood are usually, it's a more progressive position to desire Puerto Rican statehood and a more conservative position to not. It's complications, but that's usually how it goes. On the island, that's also complicated, but kind of switched. Statehood is the more conservative position, and independence is the most sort of left position, but Commonwealth is still more left than statehood.
When Bataan and Corregidor fell, many Filipino soldiers melted into the jungle and fought heroically as guerrillas and disrupted Japanese efforts. Was this recognized by the United States?
Okay, so we are in World War II. So I'm just orienting everyone. We're in World War II. There is a mixed force that has mainlanders and Filipinos. They're all part of the U.S. Army, but they're sort of coming to it from different places, and they are fighting to defend the otherwise unfortified island against the Japanese, and they are unable to. They are overwhelmed. They're not prepared. They don't have the proper equipment. They're not properly trained, and there's not enough of them. So what happens is there's a kind of, the fate of the mainlanders gets a lot of attention. The death march of Bataan and the men who suffered on that. Movies are made about it. The fate of the Filipinos is a little less recognized. Some of them, in fact, are sent to the same prison camps. In fact, more Filipinos than mainlanders are. So the Death March of Bataan is mainly a Philippine event rather than a mainland event. But nevertheless, there are a lot of people who aren't captured, but nevertheless continue to fight as guerrillas against the Japanese, and with some kind of affiliation with the U.S. Army and sometimes not. And the question is, what happens to them? Well, first of all, a really hard thing is that when the United States gives the Philippines independence, it writes off all Filipinos who fought in the U.S. Army. They are no longer veterans of the U.S. Army, despite the fact that they fought at great cost for the United States, because part of decolonization is just kind of a washing the hands of them. So and that's a source of enormous resentment in the Philippines. The other thing is that a lot of those guerrilla groups don't just have views about Japan versus the United States. They're not just anti-Japanese, they're also anti-landlord. And one of the things they try to do is to overturn the Philippine oligarchy and redistribute lands. And so once the Philippines become independent, they keep fighting. And they're fighting for a fair distribution of land. And the United States fights against them. It helps reinstall a kind of landlord elite to the independent Philippines. And then it supplies napalm as a lot of these guerrilla groups that had formerly fought with and sort of been the leading edge of United States combat in the Philippines are then napalmed by the United States until they're suppressed. So it's a really bitter story, and at least from the perspective of those guerrilla groups that had fought with the United States.
How is the colonial experience different for Panama versus some of the other owned areas?
Yeah, Panama is really interesting. So Panama itself is never colonized by the United States. It's never annexed to the United States. But a part of Panama it's not technically annexed, but it is leased by the United States on a lease that is so good that it's basically ownership. I mean, it's such a strong lease, and it gives the United States all kinds of jurisdictional powers over the Panama Canal Zone. The Panama Canal Zone is not enormous. It's 10 miles wide, but it runs right through the country. So if you live in Panama, you have to cross the U.S. zone to get from one part of Panama to another. And that, you can imagine there's a kind of painful history that goes along with that. So legally, it's a different kind of situation in that the Panama Canal Zone is never annexed to the United States like the Philippines is. But a lot of the same sort of colonial patterns play out. And I talk about some of them in my book about how the United States sort of seeks to not just control the people in the zone, but control them as they go out into Panama and to control the ecology of the zone. It becomes a very weird space. We can talk about that more if you'd like.
I want to thank you for doing this tonight. This has been fabulous. I've greatly enjoyed this. I think it's fascinating to take a look at, again, the graphic you did of the mainland and the rest of it was top notch. That was well done. So thank you very much for doing this tonight. It's yes, it's always good to see another Big Ten guy. So I'm really happy with that. In fact, later this week, I got a professor from Purdue. So I'm taking care of the old home, the old stomping grounds. The name of the book is How to Hide an Empire. It is available at 8 Cousins. Thank you so much for doing this. This has been tremendous. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. This has been great. So thank you for joining us tonight. Stay safe, everybody.
All right, an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for coming out for this.